A man washed ashore last week. He looked as though he had not eaten in weeks and was barely clinging to life. I, along with much of the town, was elated when we discovered it was Will Harper who had washed ashore, and that he would make a full recovery. The fishing vessel named Prosper had set sail 3 months prior. It never returned. 18 men, including Will Harper, were all presumed to be dead. However, with the return of Will Harper came stories. Stories of how they had found an island lush with jungle, with friendly natives and enormous wealth. He told stories of how the crew of the Prosper had found a paradise and wished not to leave. Only Will Harper was willing to sail the Prosper back home to tell their families that they were not returning. However, on the return trip, as the Propster's only sailor, he did not last long as a squall overtook him quickly, sending her down to the depths, and Will Harper alone at sea for weeks. At first people didn't believe him. The Prosper was a small enough vessel, and Harper a competent sailor enough to make it back in one piece. Surely he was not telling the entire story. However, as days went by, his story did not change. In fact, the more he told it, the more he lit up with joy in describing the place he had seen. Only a couple days had passed before he was trying to get another vessel together to sail back to the unknown island. With his fantastical tales and unwavering faith, he eventually was able to muster a small crew and another fishing vessel named the Vandal, of which I too joined Pearlie out of curiosity. 4 days ago we set sail with Will Harper leading the way, the captain Frederick Gould in command, and 13 others who wanted to see what this unknown island paradise had to offer. The Vandal had made quick work getting out to sea, but struggled to maintain heading with this inexperienced crew of adventurers and thrill-seekers. Captain Gould was perturbed by their lack of experience after quickly becoming seasick, but Will Harper kept his eyes facing east, continually looking over the horizon through a spyglass. Yesterday, Will Harper exclaimed loudly to the entire crew that he could see it, just over the horizon, and they had but barely a couple hours to go. After 3 days at sea, the crew hurriedly began to do what they could to steer and speed the vessel towards where Will Harper had said it was. After an hour, we began to see something breaking through the horizon. We all smiled at one another as we continued to sail. As we got closer, the shape on the horizon got bigger. As the shape on the horizon got bigger, our excitement grew bolder. As our excitement grew bolder, we looked at the shape harder. When we looked at the shape harder, we saw the lie. The shape that had grown out of the horizon was not a lush island, as Will Harper had said, but a jagged outcropping of rocks breaking the surface of the sea. Before we had time to correct our course, the wind began to pick up, filling the sail and pushing us towards the outcropping. That's when I heard it. Over the cursing at Will Harper, over the commands being yelled by Capitan Gould, over the gusts of wind, I heard it. I heard a melody pierce through the air and into my soul, a soft lullaby that filled my heart with a peace I had never once felt before. All at once every other sound faded away. I know not if it was due to being filled with the melody, or if it was because the other began to feel it too. As the Vandal approached the outcropping, I saw them. Maidens swimming in the sea along the rocks, beautiful women with silky hair of jet black, pale skin with a bluish tinge, and tails like that of fish. Will Harper was the first to jump in, and as he did, one of them turned and swam over to him before opening her arms to greet him. As she breached the surface, the face I saw was that of the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Her small features and slender frame were dwarfed by the rocks and the open sea. Despite this, her mere presence commanded our attention. Soon, more sailors were jumping off the boat and swimming over. Harper got there first, and the melody began to grow quieter. As it did, I could hear her speak in a honey-soaked voice that filled every pore with ecstasy. "Welcome home," she slowly said. At those words, I jumped in. As I jumped off the bow, I could see more of the women circling the other sailors, their melodies joining that of the first, filling the air with a cacophony of song. I didn't care. I was no longer anxious or afraid. I was full, I was light, I was happy, and nothing would ever feel as good as listening to these words, to these voices. Through the songs I could hear cries, but I did not care. As I swam, I saw the blue ocean begin to turn red, but I did not care. As I moved to the voices, an arm that was without its sailor got in my way, and I moved it. Nothing was going to keep me from the voices of the angelfish before me. I found myself almost at the outcropping when she swam to me. I am still unsure if it was the first one I had seen, or if it was one of the others, but I no longer cared. Her hands grabbed my arms and pinned them to my sides, and for the first time I looked into their eyes. Their eyes were completely black, empty and soulless. The melody intensified as her mouth smiled, her pale blue lips pulling back, revealing numerous rows of sharp, bloodied teeth. She pulled me in and I closed my eyes, tears of joy as her cold skin touched mine. Over the melody that filled me, she whispered a single request in my ear. "Bring us more. Today, I woke up on the shore. The one who found me says I have been gone for 3 weeks, but it only feels as though it has been a day. I can still hear the melody faint in the back of my head, but it is fleeting and quickly fading. I need to go back, and I need to bring more." The first thought that crossed my mind as I hit the water was how warm it was. We left for Galapagos in mid-December, arriving on site towards the end of the month. I thought it would be cold. December has always been a time of cold nights and long snowy days for me. So when I broke the water and was greeted not by an icy wall of goosebumps-inducing darkness, but a comfortable lukewarm ocean, I was pleasantly surprised. An unpleasant surprise followed shortly after, as the radio in my ear blared to life, the voice of Anne, already grainy and hard to make out despite being only 15 feet above me, highlighting the budgetary shortcomings of our expedition. "Ground control to Kappa 1. Actually, I wouldn't be ground control, would I? Since I'm, not on the ground. What would you call the boat version of ground control?" Anne asked, our new radio quickly becoming a toy in her eyes. "Now hang on, why am I Kappa 1? I called back into the radio, ignoring her question that I admittedly did not know the answer to. "Because Kappas live in the water, duh," she called back rather matter-of-factly before giggling at her own cleverness. A splash is heard some distance to my left before the radio picks up again, a man's voice this time. "This is Kappa 2, I'm in the water," Brett called out, our youngest member, though he had been with the company longer than I had. "You don't need to say that, I watched you jump in," Anne called, chastising. "I know, just couldn't let you two have all the fun with the new radio," Brett rebutted, while I was slowly starting to regret our buying the thing. "All right, enough playing around, we're wasting sunlight," came the voice of our senior, Robert. He was as no-nonsense as ever, although this was somewhat endearing of him. He always kept a cool head on his shoulders and kept us focused. "Jason, move into the bell. Brett, retrieve the sea scooter and join him. We want this done before sunset," Robert directed through the radio. I wasted no time swimming over to the large device dangling from our boat by a thick metal cable. It was almost shaped like a bell, as our nickname suggested. A large bottom-heavy structure that narrowed at the top and widened at the bottom. It was around 7 feet tall, and half that in diameter. 4 small round windows positioned on its north, south, west, and eastmost sides, and 1 large hatch on the bottom. As I moved to climb inside this hatch, Brett joined me at my side, using the sea scooter to catch up, its light illuminating the diving chamber in the dark ocean water. I was a little jealous Robert had chosen him to pioneer the sea scooter for our company, and not me. It was a small device, no bigger than the motor of a weed whacker. At its rear were 2 handles with a small lever to pull on the right, and a button for the light on the left. Attached to these handles was the motor, a loud thing, strong enough to turn the blades at the front of the device to propel its occupant forward faster than they could swim. Just beyond the propellers, right in the center, was a large light. I could see Brett's smile showing through the thin glass of his mask as he delighted in his new toy, and we both climbed into the chamber, sealing it shut behind us while it began to build pressure. I took a seat opposite Brett, and we could feel the chamber moving, sinking through the water a few feet at a time. It was an odd sensation. The water inside didn't jostle or move, but we could feel the world pulling upon us as we sank down deeper and deeper. Robert's voice came over the radio again, growing fuzzier, but not so much that we couldn't make it out. "Remember to watch your depth gauges and don't go too deep. Those suits the Noe lent us will get you to the vents, and maybe a little deeper." Let's not find out how much deeper. Just chart the entrance of the trench, leave your markers, and get back to the bell." "Roger, Roger," Brett called into the radio, and I heard Robert let out a sigh. Now we started the wait. As the chamber sank into the depths, it built pressure to acclimatize us to the pressure of the ocean at our desired depth. That way we could get out, do our work, and decompress in the bell instead of doing decompression stops in open water, which was going to be nice, as decompression from this depth should take close to 14 hours. Our air tanks hooked up to tubes in the bell, running up the cord of the bell all the way up to the surface, so we shouldn't have to worry about running out of air. I stared at the depth gauge on my left wrist, watching it tick up as it worked even from within the bell, ticking past 1,000 meters already. It was nice to have such a fancy bit of hardware in the form of these suits. Our bell and scooter were as outdated as they get, and our boat was on her last sea legs. This job could have been the start of something new, with any luck. It would lead to more business with the NOAA, and our little diving shop might make it big. Suddenly, a question shot to the front of my mind. A question I aired over the radio to our captain. Why us? My question was met with silence at first, and a funny look from Brett before he spoke up. "Well, because Anne doesn't dive, she mans the ship, and Robert's too old to make it down here anymore. Careful too, you know he's sensitive," Anne teased back at us, and Robert let out what could have been a chuckle, or maybe a cough. It was hard to tell. "That's not what I mean. I mean, why did the NOAA hire us for this? Don't they have divers, and divers with better gear? Divers they trust with these fancy suits a hell of a lot more than a basically unheard-of diving team?" There was a long silence after this. I thought maybe he knew the answer, but didn't want to say. It seemed everyone took a few moments to ponder this question. Or maybe the others were waiting for our captain's response like I was. Regardless, our thoughts were interrupted by the bell jerking to a stop, causing us to swing and sway in the water before we steadied again. Brett was up first, hands cupped around his eyes at the window, searching for whatever it was we came here for. No, that can't be right," he mumbled to himself before beginning to undo the hatch. I moved to the window to see whatever it was he saw, but I saw nothing. An endless expanse of dark water lay before me. At least I think it did. It was dark and I couldn't make out much. "What is it? I don't see anything." My eyes didn't leave the window as I asked, waiting to see some colossal beast swim by, or some ravaged sea life, my mind starting to swim as I waited for his answer. He didn't reply, not until he had left the bell, ducking out into the water and drifting just below the hatch, floating motionless in place as he looked out at the surrounding ocean, the lights of the bell finally clicking on, revealing more of the nothingness around us. "That's the problem, check your depth gauge." And I did as he instructed, reeling at our depth. We were 2,600 meters below the surface, the deepest anyone had ever gone without a submersible. "The vents," he started. "We should have hit the floor 50 meters ago. This can't be the right place. The hydrothermal vents are gone." He sounded angry and a little confused. Robert called to him over the radio, trying to calm him down. "Brett, it's a newly formed trench. The vents are still there, just moved. If you get back into the bell, we can adjust the position until we find the edge. It shouldn't be more than a few dozen meters away." Brett ignored him, swimming away from the bell now. "But Brett," I called out, "stay near the bell. If you get lost down here, I was cut off before I could finish, Brett starting to shout into the radio, turning his sea scooter on, and propelling forward, with me following along against my better judgment, trying to keep a mental note of where the bell was. "No, this is impossible. The edge isn't a dozen meters away. There is no edge. This trench is massive. A trench this large forming and so close to land. There should have been tsunamis and earthquakes. This kind of damage doesn't just happen without anyone noticing." We were at 2,700 meters, and getting deeper by the second as he searched for the ocean floor. Comms were quiet for a few moments before Anne spoke up. "Brett, it's okay. I need you to go back to the bell. We'll figure this out, and I'm sure the NOAA have an explanation for what happened here." She spoke soothingly, and Brett slowed, coming to a stop at 2,750 meters, with me just a few behind him. He took in a breath, looking around the expanse of ocean before us. He had always been more of an environmentalist than I. I can't imagine how seeing such an important part of sea life cease to exist must have made him feel. I put a hand on his shoulder, trying to guide him back. Come on, let's get back to the bell. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can get answers. He looked back at me, his face betraying how upset he was as he tried to sound calm. He didn't look angry anymore, just sad. Maybe that was worse. Yeah, okay. He spoke softly and with a sigh, starting to position the scooter to take us back when suddenly we saw something. What is that? Brett asked, his tone curious as a small dark object slowly floated up towards us from the chasm below. It looks like a fish, he offered, and he seemed to be right. A small skinny fish was floating up between us at our legs now. Robert's concerned voice came over the radio, each word dripping worry. What do you see? Are you two all right? Anne was also talking now, her voice quiet and meek. Is there something down there with you? The fish kept on rising. It wasn't swimming. Its side was facing up, tail dragging behind it, and one empty eye socket pointed to the sky. And it was covered in what looked like red seaweed, wriggling and waving in the light ocean current. It looks like a dead fish. It's just floating here. Brett finally answered, though his calm demeanor was broken by what I said and what we saw next. There are more, look, I pointed down, seeing dark shapes rising towards the surface from below, dozens of them. Fish, turtles, stingrays, all looking half decayed, none moving. Each one was covered in the red seaweed. Some had much bigger patches of it on them than others. And as the fish rose closer to us, we could see at last that it was not seaweed, but what looked to be worms of some sort, sticking out of dozens of small holes in their skin. They were skinny and long, each one waving around in the water as though feeling for something else to latch onto. At what appeared to be their head was a single disc-like growth, flat and skinny, but relatively wide, maybe an inch and a half in diameter. Brett slowly reached towards the thing, his hand tentative, but driven on by his growing curiosity. As his hand approached the fish, I thought to stop him, to reach out and swat his hand away, or to tell him no. Instead, movements made clumsy by the water all around us, I reached out and touched the fish. Instantly the worms had driven the flat growths of their heads against my suit's glove, and I felt an awful pinching sensation as they wriggled and shook violently. I let out a yelp, shaking my hand as I tried to dislodge the creatures, but they held fast, the pain in my hand increasing as my panic rose. I thought to grab them and pry them off, but I feared more were inside the corpse of the fish, waiting to latch onto me and exacerbate the situation. Finally, Brett grabbed my wrist and with his knife cut at the wretched things. They held for a few cuts, before withdrawing into the fish, releasing my glove. None of them had been severed by his knife. I looked at my shaking hand, sucking in deep breaths as I tried to calm myself. The voices of Robert and Anne cutting each other off as they tried to ask me what was wrong, what was happening to me, and demanding we return to the bell. My glove had several large indents in the material. The gloves were a strong fabric, but here it seemed they were almost chewed through, long cut like scrapes in circles moving towards a central point, where each of the worms had held onto me. Brett's voice came over the radio, the other two resigned to not getting an answer and clearing the comms. It's all right, they didn't get in. Captain, there are some sort of worms living in the dead sea life down here, definitely unfriendly. We're going back to the bell. Get ready to take us up. I'll get on the radio with the Coast Guard and man the crane. Robert's voice was stern and commanding. It was comforting to have someone sound collected and in control of the situation. Looking around us, things were not in control. Dead sea life was all around us, slowly moving past as they floated for the surface. It was like a swarm of jellyfish. We didn't want to get close and touch any of them, but if we didn't move more, would float up and surely touch us. Looking around, I didn't even know where the bell was. We had left it so long ago, and orientating yourself in the open ocean was like spinning around in a pitch-black room and then trying to find the bed. Where's the bell? I asked more to myself than anyone else. Anne and Robert couldn't help us reach it. The best they could do is keep it in place and hope we see the lights again. We have to go back the way we came. Just go nice and slow, and I'll use the scooter to push them out of the way. Brett presented his plan, and it sounded like a good one. He moved in front of me, using the light of his sea scooter to shine us a clear path, and turned the engine on. This was a mistake. Once the engine turned on, the sea life stopped moving, each one close enough for us to see stop dead in their tracks, no longer drifting towards the surface. "What the hell?" Brett choked out before slowly but surely each decaying fish began to move towards us. Where before we had a path, we were now slowly being closed in on by a mass of dead animals, worms reaching with all their might towards us. Brett's voice was scared now, lacking the determination his plan had afforded it before. "Captain, they're coming towards us. We can't slip past, not this many," he cried out, pointing the light of the scooter around like it was some sort of gun to hold them back. Not they responded. They crawled on, moving closer and closer. "Stay calm, son. There has to be a way out. Just stay calm and keep looking around. There are Coast Guard ships on the way now," Robert assured us over the radio. I knew it wouldn't matter. Even if the Coast Guard were here right now, they could never make it to these depths, not without our suits. Maybe with a submersible. But then what would they do? Ram the things out of the way. I kept this to myself, not wanting to upset Brett any more than he already was. I needed him to come up with a plan like before, some way to get us out of here. It struck me then, if I were wrong, well, we wouldn't need to sea scooter anyways. I reached out and grabbed it, pulling it away from him. "Hey, don't you leave me here," he cried out, fear in his eyes as he held tight. But it didn't matter. I was bigger than him, and after a brief tussle, I had the scooter. I pointed it away from us, turned the engine up to medium, and let go, watching it drift away from us. "What are you doing?" Brett demanded, grabbing my shoulder and spinning me around to face him. "We needed that. You've killed us both." Around this time, the first fish drifted past us, towards the direction of the sea scooter. He let go and turned around. We had to dodge them a bit, but they were moving past us, leaving us alone. I think they were drawn to the sound. When you turned it on, they came towards it, so I turned it up and sent it away. I explained, trying to keep him calm. "Well, you could have just said that, asshole." He was still angry, but too relieved to hold on to it. He turned, and we both started to swim, making our way to where he claimed the bell was, careful to avoid the sea life that hadn't been close enough to notice the sea scooter. With each passing meter, I grew more concerned. If this was the wrong direction, we were only getting ourselves more lost. And these dead things were still here with us. A little more spread out, but they were here. And I was worried more would come and it would become too dense a group to swim through. As my fears began to bubble to the surface and form words in my throat, my thoughts were interrupted again when Brett shouted over the radio. "There it is, the light! I can see the bell!" I swam a bit faster, straining to see what he saw, and sure enough, just ahead there was light. He swam towards it, fast, waving his arms and breathing heavily as he raced for it, ignoring the fish floating around him and rushing for the bell. As we got close, I began to notice something. There was something big just below it. "Brett, stop! There's something there!" I tried to call, but over his frantic breathing, the radio was too garbled for him to understand. Maybe he thought I was celebrating as well. I should have tried harder, yelled louder, something. But I didn't think he would be able to hear me. And as he neared the bell, the thing below rose into the light, coming into view and freezing him in his tracks. It was a whale, a huge humpback whale. But this one wasn't dead and it wasn't drifting, though just barely. It had huge holes all along its left side in tightly packed clusters. The skin they clustered on was swollen and infected, the holes leaking a dark fluid into the water. Its body was lumpy, long tubular growths protruding all down its back into its tail, and these bumps wriggled and moved, twitching and causing the body to move along with them. One of its eye sockets was empty, and the other eye, while still there, had a large hole in it, with a huge worm sticking out of the front. It slowly approached Brett, its one big eye locked onto him as the worm reached for him, both of us frozen in shock. As it neared him, the whale let out an awful sound, a groan of pain and anguish, as its mouth was pushed open by a mass of worms inside. They reached out, latching onto Brett, causing him to jolt to action again, flailing and screaming, jabbing at them with his knife to no avail as one latched onto his face, slowly pulling him into the mouth. He screamed into it, screamed and cried, and fought for all he was worth, but he wasn't getting away, and I only watched as it took him. Once he was gone and the mouth was closed, his screams did not stop. They kept coming over the radio, drowning out anything anyone else might have tried to say. The whale then slowly sank, leaving the light of the bell and vanishing into the darkness. I wasted no time swimming for all I was worth, looking at the bell and hoping that maybe, if I didn't look, I wouldn't have to see it rising to swallow me too. But it didn't swallow me. It didn't return as I swam into the bell, didn't attack me as I sealed the hatch and pressed the button to return me to the surface. And it didn't rip the bell from the ship and sink me to the ocean floor as I waited for the bell to slowly rise out of the depths. But he did scream. He screamed the whole way, and as he did, his screams slowly became groans of pain, muffled by whatever it was that had him. And just when I thought I couldn't take the screams anymore, he spoke. He begged. He begged not for his life, not for rescue, not for me to come back and save him. He begged me to kill him, pleaded with me in a voice so weak and with breath so raspy, breathing wheezily, unnaturally. He pleaded with me, and with God, and with the devil to kill him and free him from the pain he suffered. And when our radios finally disconnected, I wept, and I hoped he got his wish. I don't dive anymore. I man the crane, but I'll never get in that water again. I'd leave, say goodbye to this life and to the water forever. But I can't do that to Robert and Anne. I can't leave them and this business behind, after what we went through together. So I man the boat and I lower the bell. But I don't think the ocean is safe anymore. Because sometimes on long jobs during late nights on the water, our radio will pick up something. It's always staticky and hard to make out, but I know what it is. He's still begging us to kill him. A few days ago, I uprooted my entire existence and relocated to the southwest cape of Stewart Island, New Zealand. Initially, I had intended this trip as an escape, to be shared with my wife as we lived out the rest of our days in beach-dwelling bliss. Yet, as we aged, I began fostering a general disdain for the direction that society seemed to have chosen for itself. I simply grew weary of the unceasing, perpetually fruitless debates over issues like race, homosexuality, political agendas, abortion, and the like. As far as I was concerned, people could do as they wished, as long as they weren't harming anyone else, simple-minded and a bit naive, perhaps, but my stance nonetheless. With my frustration mounting, my wife and I began planning the move in our late 30s, hopefully with 2 full decades ahead of us to get our affairs properly aligned to allow for such an exodus. But the train derailed as I reached 43, and she was diagnosed with an untreatable brain tumor. 2 years later, I was alone and wanted nothing more than to expedite my exit from mainstream civilization. I sold our house and our cars, the latter being more painful as I prized my '69 Stingray convertible. Nonetheless, the profit from its sale was necessary to procure adequate funding for my relocation. Disappearing is no cheap venture, and it brought me an odd sense of closure in regards to that chapter of my life. The crippling depression from the loss of my wife remained, but I felt little remorse for the loss of our lifestyle. The outdoors had always been a passion of mine since my earliest memory. Fishing, kayaking, game hunting, cross-country hiking, and anything else without a ceiling over it had always been my forte. My spirit yearned for a climate requiring a survivalist mentality, and I had every intention of spending the rest of my days in just such an environment. Thus, my research led me to Stewart Island, the southernmost portion of New Zealand. The mild climate, sparse population, immediate access to open water, and dense forestry completed my checklist. The prospect of dangerous wildlife or poisonous vegetation brought me no qualms. After all, there aren't even any terrain-dwelling snakes on the island. What few locals were present on Stewart Island were nice enough upon my arrival, having harbored a few tourists here and there for the more accessible beaches. I did draw a few laughs from the older residents when I told them where I planned to go, and encountered one old man that simply shook his head and walked away when I mentioned the Southwest Cape's eastern shore. But I could not be discouraged. There was no turning back. My final stop was at the local supply depot in Oban. There, I purchased a map, 2 books on native flora and fauna, a leather-bound journal, ink, a canteen, an axe with a 36-inch handle, a hunting knife, 30 feet of braided paracord, a small fishing kit, waterproof matches, a compass, and a Swiss gear pack to place it all in. I told myself that if I had forgotten anything, I didn't need it, or would be able to construct it for myself. Either way, I would either make do or die, and although I wouldn't describe myself at the time as suicidal, death didn't seem such a horrible alternative. The hike to the Southwest Cape took me almost 3 days, the journey made longer because of the mud from recent rains. Sleep was difficult the first night, as it had been some time since I had slept on the ground, and the reality of my endeavor finally began to sink in. While experienced within the natural world, slight anxiety came over me upon the realization that I may have bitten off more than I could chew, and I had no fallback option. Juxtaposed with this thought was a comfort in knowing that my newfound worry indicated a resurgence in my will to live. Eventually, my psyche balanced these two notions, and I did manage to sleep a few hours, awaking with renewed confidence in the face of the rising sun. Days 2 and 3 were largely uneventful, save for a brief but violent thunderstorm and a confrontational encounter with what may have been a brush-tail possum. Despite the critter's sincere efforts, I found myself on the coastline midday of the 3rd. Authentic peril would not rear its head until that evening. My efforts in constructing camp that day concluded with the completion of a water collection basin that I devised from several broad ferns and a species of bamboo that I knew had been introduced to the area centuries before. Previously, I had created a small hut of the same bamboo and ferns to serve as my shelter until I ventured to build something more ambitious, along with a moderate fire and a few limb lines for fishing. Resigning myself to relaxation for the remainder of the day, I took off my clothes and my boots and braved the somewhat murky but refreshing surf. Initially, I was met with intrigue in regards to the gradient at which the water deepened. Approximately 100 meters from shore, I found myself only knee-deep, and I could feel the soft, white sands beneath my soles. In hindsight, perhaps the lack of aquatic life in the area should have been an indicator of something amiss, but I was still planted firmly in the euphoria of my self-engineered renaissance. I stood for perhaps another 30 seconds, merely observing my surroundings, and then took a step forward. From there, I cannot convey the alarm that I experienced when I was suddenly and completely submerged. I'm ashamed to say that my instinctual reaction was panic. I had not seen any darkening of the water to indicate such a drastic depth change, and yet there I was. I kicked frantically for the surface and found it soon enough, gasping for breath. As I regained my composure, I cursed my neglect for not bringing goggles or a snorkel, for who knew what sort of wonder-laden reef I may have stumbled upon. Regardless, my decision to resubmerge was met by terror, surpassed only by events that would occur later. I exhaled just enough oxygen to go under and stabilize at approximately 3 meters. I thought that maybe the water somehow became more buoyant at this point, but disregarded the feeling as my imagination. I decided to open my eyes despite the salinized water. I peered down. Deep below me, in a black abysmal hole that can only be described as a void, were a pair of whitewashed eyes, visible only because of their apparent uncanny ability to reflect such finite amounts of light. The pupils were entirely black, with no rings of color, and appeared to be transfixed upon me. I was stricken with fright, yet unable to save myself from my impending doom. Entranced, I continued to stare downward, waiting for the appearance of some gaping hole of a mouth to inhale me into the terrible unknown of its insides. But the moment never came. I received, whether it was from some sort of telepathy or my own intuition, the distinct feeling that this mammoth creature wished to harm me, in ways that man had never known, but something was holding it back. I could not fathom what could possibly be restraining the beast, its size surely rivaling that of a submarine or battleship. My chest burning for air brought me back from my fearful marveling, and I tried desperately to swim to the surface, yet I still could not move. I remember only the taste of salt and stagnant water as I drifted into merciful unconsciousness, a strange pang of relief echoing in my thoughts. I awoke on the beach on what seemed to be the next morning, face up with a strand of kelp around my midsection, and a feeling not unlike a hangover. I jolted upward, aggravating my headache, but deeming it more important to scan the water for the creature. I spied nothing but the crashing waves and scattered fragments of driftwood. I collapsed back onto the sand and gazed into the overcast sky, edging on delirium, and only capable of thinking of the eyes. Oh God, the eyes. After an eternity of contemplation, I found the motivation to rise and attempt to carry on. I could find no rational explanation short of some strange hallucination, but could recall nothing that would have caused it. Throughout the day, my intellect continued to pull me towards the multitudes of legends and unsolved mysteries of the unexplored sea unknown sounds captured on tape, megalodon sharks, Jules Verne novels, the Bermuda Triangle, and others similar. Nothing I could fathom satisfied me, and I despaired with no discernible reason as to why I did not abandon my supposed slice of paradise. And a dull anxiety that persisted for the remainder of the day. I cut my fishing lines, simultaneously knowing that they would yield nothing while also fearing what may be present at their ends. It was then that I realized I had witnessed not a single marine life form. My fire had smoldered to ashes, so I replenished it, gathering driftwood from the beach and dried foliage from the tree line, all the while keeping a wary eye on the water, awaiting the appalling eyes that resided below the surface. On that day they made no appearance. There should be no surprise that I did not sleep well that night, having exhausted my wildlife manual and illuminating no form of insect or animal, otherwise that could have induced my experience. By morning, however, my distress began to dissipate, as my mind exhausted itself and simply relegated its time to other things, food for example. At some point after dawn, I made the decision to hike somewhat inland and try my hand at trapping, as fishing seemed foolish, and I felt the need to get away from the shore for a time. I endeavored to create 6 traps, all sling rigs camouflaged with the litter of the forest. It was during my search for an animal sign that I discovered the Emma. The schooner with its name etched in fading stain on its stern was approximately 500 meters inland, lying capsized on its deck, with several varieties of vine and runners growing around the masts, which had been forced through the bottom of the hull, and stood erect, as if the ship had been dropped on its top from a great height. The hull itself was perhaps 20 meters, large enough for a dozen crew members at the most. Curiously enough, there were immense circular patterns etched into the ship's surface, as if a gargantuan plecostomus had scraped a meal of algae from the vessel while it was still afloat. Summarily, I decided that I could adapt and renovate the craft into my permanent residence, its location away from the waterline suddenly appealing. I finished setting my traps at a distance and began my new project immediately. The labor was invigorating. I was so excited about my fortune in finding the Emma that I nearly forgot about my encounter, thinking of it only occasionally and partially settling on dehydration as a likely culprit. Using my axe, I cut an entry to the hull and began clearing what little sun-starved growth there was, along with eradicating any unwanted inhabitants. I battled briefly with the notion that I might find human remains or even lost treasures, but discovered neither. My only finding was an old leather volume, coming apart at the spine. It was apparent that the tome had been either sunken or rained on, as indicated by the illegible remains of water-diluted ink on the pages. The only decipherable items were 2 in number, a single date, March 21st, 1925, and the phrase, "It calls me," near the bottom of the last used page. I presumed at the time it was a sailor referring to the call of their personified ocean. Finally satisfied with the day's accomplishments, I checked my traps, another brush-tail possum and something resembling a kiwi, and trudged back to the shoreline campsite. I had actually managed to wholly put the day before out of mind, until I looked to the eastern horizon. In the sun's late glow I stared yet again at it, this time with its eyes and a portion of its massive head breaching the surface. The eyes maintained their washed-out quality, despite reflecting the incoming sunset, and now with some reference, I could see the thing was much larger than I had originally estimated. Its scalp appeared cephalopodan in nature, with a wet olive-green hue and likely a layer of some sort of plasmatic coating. Just beneath the water's now churning surface, I could distinguish at least 8 serpentine masses, seeming to extend from the head, writhing together with some form of lateral undulation. As before, I could not move. Sometime during this I fell to my knees, not out of dumbfounded dread but some instinctual need to kneel, as if before royalty. I don't recall being explicitly told to do so, but I felt it an intelligent thing to do for the sake of my continuing to be. As I reached the ground, however, I again lost consciousness as the nightmare began to emerge, its mouth opening to reveal concentric rings of teeth and emitting a bellowing groan, akin to a great horn signaling battle. I awoke this time where I had fallen, with a mouthful of sand and that hung-over feeling. There was a full moon, evocative of the thing's pale gaze. I was forced then to accept what I had seen as real. Upon awakening, I reluctantly went down to the water to rinse my mouth of the sand, but found it rancid, congealed with a layer of briny foam and the smell of decaying shellfish. There were great divides in the sand, as if something had been dragged. I returned to my collection basin, and then noticed the collapsed trees and trampled undergrowth. A horrible notion struck me, and I ran back to the Emma only to find it absent. I then thought for the first time that I had overstayed my welcome on Stewart Island. Quickly, I gathered what was left of my supplies back at the shoreline and began hiking northeast towards Oban at dawn, any hope of salvaging my adventure firmly severed. I would gladly resume my yuppie life in the States if it meant never having another encounter with the behemoth. For the first hour or two I made excellent time, motivated by my panic, and perhaps sufficient to cut a day from the duration of my hike. But I hadn't truly rested for days, and it began to take its toll. Sometime around noon, I leaned against a tree to rest. I despised stopping, yet slept almost instantly, my mind and body finally giving in to fatigue. As I slept, I experienced what can only be described as a prophecy. I stood back in the water where I had fallen under, my back to the shore. I watched the black water as it progressed from fine bubbling to roiling. I could sense that I should wade towards land, but was unable to turn around. At last I could see the eyes, still entrancing. As they rose to the surface, I again could smell the spoiled crustacean odor. And as the thing's head breached, I tried to scream but could only gasp, as I fell forward into the acrid turmoil of the monster's lair. Submerged, I opened my eyes and viewed the creature's arms and torso. It appeared oddly humanoid, but covered in scales and barnacles. Massive crabs skittered about on its skin, having made their homes in the various marine flora present there. It extended down into nothing, but continued to rise, its legs yet visible, as it became apparent that I could not comprehend the monstrosity's true size. I turned my attention to coming up for air and broke the surface. I awoke screaming and chilled, and with that, my recount has come to an end. As I turn about and realize that somehow I am back at my campsite, a quote from an author who escapes me at the moment comes to mind. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. My waking cognizance suddenly comprehends the totality of what has transpired and is driving me mad. Somehow, what I have done here has awoken something that has been dormant for time immeasurable, and like me, it tires of the world as it is. It beckons me to help it escape. As I walk out to its cursed pit, I understand that the world is ready for harvest, and I cannot purge its call emanating from the cavernous depths.